at the elements of morality. In particular, it considers consequentialist theories of ethics. My name is Gene Rice. I teach philosophy at Fort Hays State University. When we're thinking about ethical theories, we're thinking about approaches to defining right and wrong, which are philosophical in nature. That is, we're looking not necessarily at what is the case, but what ought to be or what should be the case. And in theory, anyway, each of these approaches would be applied then to all sorts of situations and cover all of our moral experience, or at least wide swaths of our moral experience. So in this presentation, we're going to look more closely not at agent or act-centered theories, but on theories which focus primarily on the consequences of action as their primary focus. We have been categorizing different philosophical theories of ethics into one of three elements: the agent, the act, or the consequence. That is not the only way to divide philosophical theories, and an even more broad or basic way of dividing them is to simply divide them based on which theories focus on consequences and which do not. And so it's often the case that philosophers and ethicists will put all of the consequentialist theories on one side and everything else on the other. And sometimes all those non-consequentialist approaches are called deontic theories, or deontic is another word for duty-based theories. So this is just another way to divide ethics, to try and get a grip on how the theories differ one from another. Consequentialism is a moral theory which says that acts themselves have no moral weight. Right and wrong is cashed out totally in terms of the goodness or badness of the consequences of a particular situation or action. So we look at the act, we look at the likely outcomes, we attempt to maximize goodness. Sometimes it's called utility, sometimes it's called happiness. But at any rate, the action itself and the agents doing the action aren't as important as the consequences. So a single action like lying might in one case be immoral, might generally be immoral because it hurts people and breeds ill will, but in certain circumstances lying might be moral. So if the inquiring murderer is looking for your friend to kill him, the consequentialist says that you should lie, and that's the moral thing to do because the consequences are better in that case than not lying. Why would a person want to be a consequentialist? Well, we already noted in the previous slide that certain actions seem to be moral in one case and immoral in the other, and the consequentialist has an easy explanation for that. The consequences differ, and so the morality of the act then differs. Another good reason to be serious about consequentialism as a philosophical approach to ethics is because many of us have weighed the pros and cons of particular actions as a kind of a natural response to considering what we should do. So if you've made a list, either a real list or just a mental list of pros and cons in a moral dilemma, you've basically been approaching that particular case as a kind of consequentialism. And so the consequentialist says, this is what we do normally anyway, and this is what we ought to do as a moral approach. So let's take an example of consequentialism in action very briefly here. Suppose your roommate comes home with a totally terrible new haircut right before they're set to go out on a big date, and they ask you, how does my haircut look? Well, the consequentialist says, whether or not you tell the truth depends upon the outcome, or the likely outcome, the consequences of either lying or telling the truth. So a positive outcome of lying would be that in the short term you don't hurt your partner's feelings, they may feel more confident going into the date. Negative outcomes, obviously, they later find out that you didn't like it or their date didn't like it. But at any rate, the consequentialist says that what is right depends not on the nature of lying or who's doing the lying, but on the outcomes. Another classic example of consequentialist thinking is to look at something like torture, which many of us may feel strongly is immoral by the very nature of what's going on in the action. But the consequentialist says that torture in and of itself is not moral or immoral, it is dependent upon the consequences. So although it may be acceptable if there is a positive outcome for utilitarians, it might be unacceptable if there are negative outcomes. So the consequentialist will allow that any action might, at least in certain circumstances, be the most moral thing to do. And this is in contrast to act-based theories or agent-based theories, which often claim that certain acts are inherently wrong. So having defined consequentialism and given a couple of examples, let's look at varieties of consequentialism, and we'll focus on three here, and really they are divided based on how they answer two key questions. The first is, whose happiness or utility is being considered? Is it mine or mine and others? And the second key question, which divides these theories, is how to define good consequences. Are we defining happiness in a purely subjective sense? Are we defining it as goodness? And if so, how does goodness differ from happiness? And so on and so forth. So different consequentialist theories will give different answers to these two key questions. Act utilitarianism is one of the most historically important versions of consequentialist thinking, begun by Jeremy Bentham. The act utilitarian approach says that we ought to maximize happiness, and we do that by considering ourselves and all those others who might be affected by our decision. So in any particular situation, each act must be weighed carefully in its positive and negative outcomes. And whichever action is most likely to produce the largest total happiness is the one we should choose. You may have heard the phrase greatest good for the greatest number. That is an utilitarian phrase and captures nicely what the act utilitarian is attempting to do. The rule utilitarian argues that instead of looking at particular actions in very specific moral scenarios, in order to aggregate or maximize happiness, we ought to instead look at creating and then following rules which promote the greatest good for the greatest number. So this is an important difference. It's often thought that rule utilitarianism avoids some of the problems of act utilitarianism. We haven't looked at those problems here in this presentation, though in class certainly, and in your book you will come across them. So the rule utilitarian shifts the focus away from specific actions onto creating and then following rules which promote the greatest good for the greatest number. So we shouldn't lie generally because lying does not promote the greatest good. Egoist approaches to ethical theorizing are often usually categorized as consequentialist theories. In opposition to various forms of utilitarianism, the egoist says that the moral thing to do is always to maximize my own happiness or utility. So this approach is still consequentialistic. It says that the actions themselves have no moral weight, rather it's the outcomes that count. But in opposition to utilitarianism, the egoist says what I ought to maximize is not the aggregate or the total good in consideration of others, but rather my own happiness or my own utility. And so egoism is a consequentialist approach to ethics. This presentation takes a closer look at the basic principles of utilitarianism. My name is Gene Rice and I teach philosophy at Fort Hays State. Let's review a little bit here on the idea of consequentialism. Remember that we were dividing theories of ethics into one of three categories, and that consequentialism was the approach that said acts themselves have no moral weight, that everything about the action should be ignored except the positive and negative consequences of the action. So we look at the likely outcomes and we attempt to maximize goodness. There are generally two types of consequentialist theory. The egoist says that when we're maximizing pleasure, we ought to maximize our own pleasure and not really consider others except so much as they may make us happy. And then there's utilitarianism, which says that we ought to maximize the pleasure for all involved. Utilitarianism is the form of consequentialism which says we should always choose the action in any situation that will lead to the greatest good for the greatest number. So the basic idea here is that ethics is about increasing the goodness in the world, increasing the pleasure or the happiness in the world. Obviously we'll have to spend some time defining what we mean by those terms, but the rest of this presentation will look more closely at three principles of utilitarianism. So the three principles of utilitarianism are the principle of utility, the principle of impartiality, and the principle of consequences. Philosophers have disagreed somewhat, even utilitarian philosophers have disagreed somewhat on exactly which of these, if any, is the most important, but for our purposes we can note here that they're obviously interlocked and work together to generate the broader theory, and of course then to generate particular outcomes when we apply the theory to actual moral cases. So the first principle of utilitarianism that we're going to look at is the principle of consequentialism, which we have already focused on somewhat. And so this is the idea that when we're in an ethical situation, what is important is not investigating the nature of the act so much as it is looking at what the consequences of an act are likely to be. And so immoral acts end up being just those which have bad consequences overall for the greater good, and moral actions are those which promote the greatest good for the greatest number. So utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. The second key element to any form of utilitarianism is the principle of utility. And this is grounded in the idea that human decision-making and human life is really based in a desire for happiness, for goodness, and so that when we choose, the ethical thing to do is to recognize that fact of human nature and to promote it, such that more happiness is the outcome. And it's obvious for the utilitarian that more happiness is better than less, that goodness should be maximized, and so ethics is a matter of doing just that. We will have to spend some time thinking and reading about different definitions of utility, whether it's subjective pleasure or some other more objective standard. Satisfaction will be an important key question. The third and final principle of utilitarianism is impartiality. This is sometimes called equal consideration of interests. It's probably the most difficult of the three principles to get our minds around. The basic idea is that when we're weighing consequences, pros and cons, we should consider everyone who might be affected by our action without bias. The principle of utility the principle of impartiality is what separates utilitarianism from ethical egoism. Egoism, remember, says that I should do whatever makes me happy. The principle of impartiality also obviously includes a kind of egalitarianism in consideration of outcomes and consequences, but this equality does not guarantee that everyone will be treated necessarily the same in the end. Let's put these three principles of utilitarianism into action with a simple example of going to see the movies. Suppose you have 4 friends and the 5 of you together are going to go see a movie. All 4 of them went to see one movie while you went to see some other movie. What should you do? According to the principles of utilitarianism, you should probably weigh the consequences carefully, seek to maximize the greatest good, and weigh those potential outcomes impartially. In this case, it's likely that because you're the only one who wants to see the other movie, you should give in and go with your friends to the movie they would like to see. Now, there may be some wild cases where the consequences would be different. Say you really want to go see movie A, and they're not so much wanting to see movie B, or not so much more than movie A. But generally, we have to weigh our happiness as one of many.